Chiara Bonfiglioli is a lecturer in Gender and Women's Studies at the University College of Cork, where she coordinates the interdisciplinary Masters in Women's Studies. Her research addresses women's and feminist history from a transnational perspective, with a specific focus on former Yugoslavia and Italy. She recently completed a monograph titled Women and Industry in the Balkans, the Rise and Fall of the Yugoslav textile sector, is forthcoming in 2019.
Yeah.
So, please, Chiara, I give you the floor.
Thank you very much. And good morning, everybody. Thank you very much to Professor Reginella and their team of collaborators for the invitation and for giving me the opportunity to be here today. Thank you also to Polona very much for her organizing efforts. Today, I would like to discuss a number of historiographical and methodological issues that are related to the study of women's citizenship in socialist Yugoslavia after World War II, and particularly related to transformations in women positions and gender relations after war and transition. I will structure my talk as follows. In the first part, I will discuss why it is important to understand the formation and evolution of the Anti-Fascist Women's Front from a transnational perspective, in light of recent debates on the lost wave of Cold War women's activism and the Women's International Democratic Federation. And secondly, I would like to discuss the AFG, or Anti-Fascist Women's Front's incorporation and readaptation of the Soviet working mother gender contract before and after 1948, as well as women's position as a marker of socialist modernity or backwardness in the construction of socialist citizenship. Thirdly, I will discuss differences among women within the AFG and the importance of adopting an intersectional approach to AFG activist biographies before and after 1953, which is the year in which the AFG was dissolved. Finally, just a short note, at the end, I will hint at the necessity of combining political history with social history when investigating gender regimes and citizenship regimes in the region. And I know today the theme is politics, so I'm not going too much into social history, but I thought it's important to mention that as well. These reflections are based on my dissertation, which was written at the University of Utrecht in 2012 on the Italian and Yugoslav feminist women's organization after 1945. So they were not feminists. I just slipped, but there's a whole discussion about that. So between 45 and 53. Both the AFG and the Unione Donne Italiane, or UDI, were very much active across borders, and that was the topic of my dissertation. And recently, I've been working more on the issue of women textile workers in socialism and post-socialism, but I continue to be interested in Cold War women's activism from a transnational perspective, and particularly on issues of non-alignment. So I'm trying to combine different perspectives on gender history in the region. And when I started to work on Cold War women's activism, it was still quite, it was still quite limited, the amount of works that existed about this particular period, because for a long time the Cold War has been seen as a moment of backlash or return home after women's participation to World War II. And there was this idea of the survival in the doldrums during this period. But actually, recently, there's been a number of monographs related to specific case studies, such as Poland, Bulgaria, and especially Italy, which are kind of re-investigating this moment of activism for women after 1945, and especially this Molly Tambor volume, The Lost Wave, she's defining Cold War women's activism on the communist and on the Catholic side as some kind of lost wave of constitutional women's rights activism. And Wendy Poyman, she's looking more at the interaction with international organizations such as the Women's International Democratic Federation. And I'm not sure how familiar you are with the federation, but also on that there's been many publications recently. The Women's International Democratic Federation was founded in Paris in December 1945. It was founded by the Union of French Women originally, but actually it became this global communist internationalist organization federating a variety of women's organizations in Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and the global South, especially newly decolonized countries. So there's been quite a growing interest in this cross-border perspective on transnational women's activism. And all these organizations, you have to think, were linked to each other through the WIDF. So the WIDF corresponded to this communist internationalist strategy of Popular Front, which was launched already in the 30s, the idea of creating also front organization to involve more people in the anti-fascist struggle. And so the WIDF was basically the federation which reunited the different national branches. And the Anti-Fascist Women's Front in Yugoslavia was one of the national branches from the very beginning, together with the Union of Italian Women. Most WIDF leaders were themselves anti-fascist activists for a long time, from 45 to, I think, 67. Eugénie Cotton from France was the president. Another very important woman was Marie-Claude Vaillant-Couturier. So there were all these women who had done the resistance. Many of them had been in prison camps during the war, and they kind of represented this generational movement somehow. And as I said, before, this whole Cold War women's activism was very much neglected, but more recently there's been a lot of debates on how we can track the agency of women in this period, especially in places like state socialist Eastern Europe. How can we talk of agency of women in non-democratic regimes? But now I will come back to the issue of agency in a moment, but first I would like to talk about women's participation to anti-fascist resistance in Yugoslavia. So you have to think that Yugoslavia, from the very beginning of the WIDF, was hailed as a very important example of women's resistance together with Soviet women. And this is because of the fact that the contribution of women to the Yugoslav Liberation War was unprecedented in Europe. Official statistics of the socialist period report 100,000 women fighting as partisans and 2 million women participating in various ways to the support of the national liberation movement. And of course, we can question this data, but it was really a very important resistance movement alongside other ones, such as the Greek or the Italian. And it has been calculated that approximately 25,000 women died in battle, 40,000 were wounded, and 2,000 of them acquired the officer's rank. However, only 91 women were designated as national heroes. These women were by no means a homogeneous group. They represented all nationalities, ages, and classes, and joined the movement for very different reasons and contributed in very different ways. So there were women's officers, as I said, as fighters, but also nurses in the army, many of them, also couriers, cooks, and typists. As Barbara Janker-Webster noted in her volume in 1990 about women and revolution in Yugoslavia, somehow the fact that the Yugoslav Communist Party had promised to constitute a federation in which all nationalities would have an equal place made it possible to embrace the struggle also as a patriotic one. For many inhabitants of places which were not having yet national rights, or for many persecuted national minorities, it became really important to join the struggle also as a way to survive. And other subjective reasons mentioned by former partisans and women, as mentioned by Webster, were a desire for social justice and the fight against the horror of Nazi fascism and local dictatorship, personal losses and dramatic events due to the civil war, but also a new sense of companionship and belonging, as well as an adherence to the party program of radical political, social, and economic change. And generally, many women just joined the liberation movement in order to survive in a context of total war and insecurity and this village by village fight. The Anti-Fascist Women's Front, or AFG, was founded in an attempt to mobilize large masses of women in the struggle against the occupation and in support of the Liberation Front. So women would be in this partisan army, but also part of this Anti-Fascist Women's Front. Since the majority of the population at that time lived in rural areas, the organization strived to gain the consensus of peasant women. The directive emitted by the Yugoslav Communist Party to create the AFG dates from 1942, and then a year earlier there was a directive issued by the Croatian section. So the AFG was established in all cities and villages and was then centralized into district, provincial, and regional levels. The directive from 42 explicitly stated that the organization was meant to be part of the national liberation movement and that its basic goal was to provide clothing, shoes, and food supplies to the army. The organization was hierarchically structured, and to quote Lidia Sklevitsky, each of its levels was represented by its own council, the lower one, village, city, having a broader base consisting of ordinary members, whereas the higher ones, such as county or region, were composed of delegates, all of them united by the Republic Council and consequently by the Federal Council. So it was really this pyramid structure that you will have this local section and then up to the Republican and until the Federal Council. Women who already experienced legal and illegal communist activities in the interwar period constituted the core of the AFG federal leadership. A fundamental distinction separated a small core of urban female leaders in the Republican Federal Council who had an education and had started this politics in the interwar period from the masses of peasant fighters and nurses, 70% of whom were estimated to be younger than 20 years of age. Also, the local AFG membership was composed mainly of older village women, often mothers and widows who had lost part of their families in the war. Despite this major difference, AFG leaders managed to find a suitable language for the daily concern of peasant women and to mobilize their traditional skills in service of the struggle. And the crucial impact of the support of female villagers for the partisan victory has been recently underlined by Jelena Batinic in her volume from 2015 called Women and Yugoslav Partisans. According to Gordana Stojakovic, who wrote about the AFG in Novi Sad and in Vojvodina more generally, around 30 journals addressing women's issues were published in the different regions of the former Kingdom of Yugoslavia from 42 to 44. In the period after 45, there were a number of journals published in the different republics, such as Žena Danas, Woman Today in Belgrade, Glas Žena Srbije, The Voice of Woman in Serbia, Žena u borbi, Woman in the Struggle in Croatia, Napredna žena, or Progressive Woman in Macedonia, and also Makedonka. So, these were in Macedonia. This journal were partly Turkish, partly Albanian as well. Naša žena in Slovenia, Radnica, or worker for the trade unions, Naša žena again in Montenegro, Nova žena or New Woman in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and so on. And also in Vojvodina, the journal was both in Serbo-Croatian and Romanian and Hungarian. So they were really striving to reach the biggest number of ordinary women, let's say. And here in this publication from Zbieg from the time of World War II, one can see this pedagogical and modernizing approach of the writers also in the images, and this effort to include peasant women and older women in the struggle. And we can see here the teacher teaching illiterate women how to read and write, and on the other hand we have this old peasant woman that's being embraced by a young, strong partisan. So there is this kind of solidarity in the struggle that is being promoted. And these similar roles are also present in the press after World War II. For instance, in this Žena Borbi picture, you can see the different roles emphasized for the socialist new woman, such as the soldier, the teacher, the peasant, the worker, and the mother. The role of the soldier and of the worker were particularly innovative and breaking with patriarchal traditions. At the same time, we also have here, again, the figure of the peasant and of the mother and teacher, which are recalling more traditional feminine roles. And I will come back again during the talk on the issue of women's position as a marker of socialist modernity, which was really a crucial element of these years. So this is not the best picture, but you get an idea. This was the first post-war Congress of the FSJ held in Belgrade in June 45. They had another Congress during the war in Bosanski Petrovac in 42. But this was the first post-war one. And this started on the 17th of June and was attended by 960 delegates from Yugoslavia and 500 guests from women's organizations in the Allied countries, such as the Soviet Union and Britain, as well as anti-fascist women from France, Italy, Albania, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. Tito himself introduced the meetings, and there was a minute of silence to commemorate the victims of the war. Then FSJ leaders, foreign delegates, and delegates from the different Yugoslav regions alternated on stage for 3 days. In his speech, after having congratulated women for their heroism during the war, Tito enumerated a series of tasks that awaited women and the whole country. And among these tasks, there were the consolidation of our popular government, the care for children and for the future young generation, the consolidation of brotherhood and unity, and the reconstruction of the country. He particularly insisted on women's role in strengthening the popular government and the brotherhood and unity among the people against what he called the enemies that were still omnipresent and against those who spread hatred among the different nationalities. He also stressed that women had the task to educate the youth in a new spirit, he said, the spirit of love towards our country, our Yugoslavia, and one here can notice affective and symbolic potential of women in times of transition, their ability to mobilize this emotional nurturing skills in spreading this love against hatred. And this was something that was noted by Lydia Sklevitsky in her work about the Anti-Fascist Women's Front and this embodying of the promise of utopia and the promise of modernity, but also this tradition and continuity in family life and private life. Another very important speech at the Congress was given by Vida Tomšić, who would become later the president of the FSJ and who was one of the most significant actors in shaping women's policies in socialist Yugoslavia. She was born as Vida Bernot in Slovenia. She became an anti-fascist activist in the interwar period when she was a law student at the University of Ljubljana. In 1934, she joined the Communist Party, and she entered the Central Committee in 1940 as one of the few, as was recalled yesterday by Andrea Feldman. She was arrested and tortured by the occupation forces during the war, and her husband, Tone Tomšić, was shot by Italian soldiers. After the war, she held key positions in the Slovene and federal government, and she contributed to the revision of the 1974 Constitution, promoting women's rights, family planning, and the right to contraception and abortion. She was also very active in international settings, such as the United Nations and the non-aligned movement, and she wrote prolifically about issues of gender and development, especially in the 70s and 80s. Her speech in 1945 was significantly centered on the issue of protection of mothers and destitute children after the human losses of the war. She reminded her listeners that in old Yugoslavia, that was, as she called it, motherhood for working women did not mean happiness, but big worries, and that infant mortality had been the highest in Europe. She promised that in the new country, the laws will not merely remain on paper, but instead that the state will provide hospitals, kindergartens for working mothers, and houses for war orphans. In fact, she stated, I quote, "Real women's emancipation cannot happen without practical concern for mothers and children." End of quote. Because of war losses and post-war reconstruction, during the FSJ Congress, there was this strong emphasis on social rights and social care for women and children, and at the same time, women's equal rights were proclaimed as some sort of result of women's participation in the resistance. So there was this idea this was the prize for taking part in the resistance, and women were able to vote for the first time in the 1945 election after having had already some vote in the partisan council during the war. In 1946, for the first time, women's rights as political, social, and economic human beings and individuals were inscribed in the new constitution. The provisions dedicated to women's equality were modeled on the 1936 Soviet constitution and thus reflected a radical revolutionary stance on previous class, gender, and national inequalities. The main concern of Yugoslav legislator was to come to terms with the different family law provisions that subsisted in a different region of interwar Yugoslavia, about which we've heard just now. The new legislation hence aimed to unify family law and to overcome discriminatory provision, notably the discriminatory treatment of women in relation to economic right, inheritance, custody of children, and the birth of illegitimate offspring. And an overview of the variety of gender relations in the region in the interwar era is very well presented in Vera Ehrlich, Family in Transition from 1960, which built upon a research that she did in the 30s. Article 24 of the Yugoslav Constitution declared women's equality, stating that women have equal rights with men in all fields of state, economic, and social political life. At the same time, women's difference as mothers was inscribed in the very same article, which continued, women have the right to the same pay as that received by men for the same work, and as workers or employees, they enjoy special protection. The state especially protects the interests of mothers and children by the establishment of maternity hospitals, children's homes, and day nurseries, and by the right of mothers to a leave with pay before and after childbirth. The idea of social motherhood, mother after the same idea in the Soviet Union, was very important in Yugoslavia in the immediate post-war period. And according to this idea, women contributed to society not only in their equal engagement in the public sphere, but also in their contribution to the reproduction of society because of their biological ability to give birth. The state, therefore, had to recognize that motherhood constituted a social contribution and accordingly had to provide adequate welfare measure for mothers and children. And this idea was not unique to the Soviet Union of Yugoslavia. We heard yesterday from Elda Guerra the importance of the category of lavoratrice madre, or mother worker in Cold War Italian women's activism. And indeed, this social motherhood model that was posited as let's say, the successful one by the Soviet Union and by the Women's International Democratic Federation was circulating across borders and became very much important also in places like Italy, where you had a substantial Communist Party, but also the Union of Italian Women. And there were really these decrees that were presented by communist MPs such as Teresa Noce on tutela delle lavoratrici madri. So this idea that the state has to provide welfare for mothers was something that was mobilized in many places in Western Europe as well. And here you can see how similar was the Soviet Constitution of '36 when it comes to women's rights. The promotion of women's labor as a key factor of women's emancipation meant that socialist policies went against the traditional lifestyle of many women living in rural areas and in less developed regions across Yugoslavia. As mentioned earlier, AFEJ leaders who were educated and emancipated were a minority, while the majority of peasant illiterate women constituted the ordinary members of the organization. This posed a problem in the post-war period when the AFEJ across Yugoslavia targeted in particular the most backward and passive masses of women, as they were called. Someone like Vida Tomšić, for instance, reasserted the idea proposed by Fourier and popularized by Marx, according to which the condition of women in a society gives the measure of the development and civilization of the same society. And that's something that is still with us today, even if we don't recognize it so much, but it's this idea that, which also had some kind of colonial undertones in a way. And the persistence of patriarchal and backward households in rural area, particularly in the southern regions of Macedonia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Kosovo, was seen as an obstacle to the modernization of the country and to its socialist achievement. One of the most important campaigns of the AFEJ in the post-war era, therefore, was the one against Ferja, or the traditional Islamic veil, which covered women from head to toe. This campaign ran from 1947 until the early 50s, when the different republics approved a number of laws forbidding the full veil. This was not a new idea. Serbian and Croatian feminist women organization had already written about the need to liberate the Muslim sisters from the slavery of the veil in the first half of the 20th century. The campaign against the veil was marked by a far-reaching faith in humanism and historical progress, and by a strong ideal of socialist modernization, as I said, which saw women's emancipation as its intrinsic component. There was also, however, a certain degree of Orientalism towards the former Ottoman territories, which were part of Yugoslavia, and towards local Muslim populations, which most of the time did not side, in many cases, did not side with the partisans during World War II. So there was also this suspicious political character to a number of these territories. In this slide, shown as a public exhibition in Zagreb in 1949, you can see the contrast between the light enlightenment of the left side of the woman giving up the veil and the darkness of women living in subjection and backwardness. So metaphors of light and darkness, progress and backwardness, modernity and tradition, humanity and inhumanity were constantly used in the FG publication designed to convince women of the benefits of taking off the veil and joining factories. Veiled women were literally portrayed as coming out of the darkness and entering the light. And here we have another quote from one of the archival sources. And the veil is defined as a symbol of the outdated, unequal status of Muslim women and a remain of a harsh past, which today impedes the full participation to women's political, social, and productive life. The law which forbade the veil was approved in Bosnia in 1950, with mixed results, and in other places such as Kosovo and Macedonia. As this and other quotes show, one of the big reasons for forbidding the veil was not just this backwardness modernity issue, but also the fact that the veil did not allow women to work as they were supposed to and to become emancipated through labor because it could cause accidents with operating machines and so on. So that was also one of the reasons that was presented. And the traditional headscarf or marama instead was considered as something acceptable and continued to be worn by peasant women of all nationalities. A report published in the journal Žena Danas in March 51, of which you can see the cover here, recounts the journey of 400 Muslim men and women from Macedonia to Belgrade, Zagreb, Ljubljana, and the seaside. The article is significantly titled, "The First Excursion of Unveiled Faces." For many participants, this was the first time they left their native village, and among these were many women who had abandoned their veil for the first time. And the writer of this editorial, Marija Marincic, she wrote about a particular Turkish woman, Asbia, who had taken off the veil and had learned her first word in Macedonian. And allegedly she said, I took off the veil. And the writer continues describing this woman. She looked at me. In that moment, I felt that all that was old in her had died, that she felt as free as I did. In her gaze there was warmth and a great joy. So allegedly, this woman, Asbia, she said, I used to live like an animal, now I know that I am a human being. And the word for human being is čovjek, so it is male, gender male word, which is something that was also very common in the partisan fight, the idea that by becoming soldiers, women would become čovjek or individuals or human beings. And this is something that Lidija Sklevitsky wrote about, this idea that when women are joining a male institution, they somehow become male by default. Even after 1948 and the break with the Soviet Union, which brought to the expulsion of the Anti-Fascist Women's Front from the Women's International Democratic Federation, this modernizing ethos and the working mother-gender contract was not fundamentally altered. Rather, new Western liberal values and values of, let's say, economic liberalism, we could say not much political liberalism, were partially incorporated in the gender vision of Yugoslavia's national ways to socialism. Scholars such as Lidija Sklevitsky and Renata Jambrosic-Kirin have discussed the gender backlash that followed 1948. Sklevitsky particularly quotes Tomšić and sees this passage as emblematic of the retraditionalization of gender relations under socialism. So Tomšić said, we want to create a socialism which will mean happiness and not what is proposed today as a model in the USSR, a gray bureaucratic socialism. We see in Russian magazine how women are badly dressed, as if it would be some kind of socialist requirement. That negates all that we look for, beauty, joy, and diversity. We need to teach women how to groom themselves well, how to take care of the household, and how to do that quickly. So this was taken by Sklevitsky as some kind of paradigm of retraditionalization of gender relations and placing women back in the home, but actually we have to see it also as a way for AFG leaders to establish a new kind of conception of the family against the peasant traditional family and against women's position as rural citizens. And as I will show through the case of Rajka Borojević, even after the dissolution of the AFG in 1953, this pedagogical effort toward the modernization of gender relations did not cease, but was framed according to the working mother-gender contract, this idea that women had to be equally active in the public and in the private sphere, being good workers and good mothers. Alongside women's improved position in the public sphere, family relations, in fact, were supposed to become modern, egalitarian, and compatible with the gender norm and custom which were typical of the educated middle class, to which the minority of AFG leaders belonged. So Susan Woodward noted that this family model was foreign to much of the population, she says, although closer perhaps to the small urban nuclear family of many policymakers, or to the marriages of political and revolutionary comrades during the war, or the radical days immediately preceding it. So there was not a replacement of, let's say, this peasant traditional Zadruga family with the radical dissolution of the family that could have been seen in the Soviet Union after the revolution. There was more this idea, okay, we need to modernize the family, but still keep the family as a unit for society. And now I'd like to move to some case studies that I developed in this publication. I wrote a book chapter for this volume, which is called Izgubljena revolucija, AFŽ između mita i zaborava. So the lost revolution, the AFŽ between myth and oblivion, which was produced by the Crvena Association in Sarajevo with the support of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation on the basis of the AFŽ archives hosted in Sarajevo, which has almost been fully digitalized. So if you will go on this afžarchiv.org website, you will find a number of documents from the period that you can freely use, and because the editors of the volume, Andrea Duganjic and Tihana Okic, they engaged in this massive work of digitalizing the collection of the state archives in Sarajevo, and they were allowed to do so, and it's somehow copyleft. So it's a very good source, I would say, also for students if they want to write a thesis or do some work. This book is now available as well in English on Viewpoint magazine. So the English version of the book came out as a series of articles online. And when contributing to the volume, what I did was try to read the experience of the AFŽ through the lenses of intersectionality, meaning through a feminist research methodology that considers gender relations in intersection with other relevant factors of social differentiation, such as class, geographical location, ethnicity, age, nationality, and sexual orientation, and other factors. I analyzed women's biographical differences within the organization and the ways in which the AFŽ function in a way as a bridge between women of different location, educational backgrounds, ethnicity, classes, and political experiences, promoting some new forms of solidarity and new life opportunities against patriarchal oppression, but also reproducing new hierarchies and forms of control over prescribed women's roles. For instance, in the case of Muslim women, but also in the case of female workers. Throughout the article, on the basis of different material, such as archives, oral history, interviews, and published sources, I consider how women's individual stories were tied to the collective framework of gender modernity and backwardness promoted by the organization, and how differences among women had a role in the articulation of AFŽ practices dedicated to the construction of modern and emancipated femininities after 1945. So as I mentioned earlier, the AFŽ was characterized by a hierarchical difference between a minority of urban educated leaders that were politicized in the interwar period and a majority of peasant and working class women who constituted the rank and file base of the organization. A fundamental distinction existed between these leaders, so the emancipated or enlightened women, and the feminine masses, or the passive feminine masses, as they were often called. The organization itself was functioning in a hierarchical way, as we heard, through this local council that were feeding into the Republican Council and the Federal Council. But at the same time, there was a lot of, next to the top-down dynamics, there were also a lot of bottom-up dynamics. So some of these women from the local villages, they would be chosen to go for travels, they would be sent reports to the Republican centers. So there was a lot of communication between the various levels. But the important thing to think about is that within the AFŽ, there were really these different femininities coexisting and meeting each other. And the best pictures I have to show this is one course that was organized in Serbia in 1943 for some peasant women for the AFŽ. And at the same time, this picture of AFŽ leaders in liberated island of Vis on the Croatian coast in 1944. So these were the kind of women who were trying to emancipate peasant women. And you really have this enormous kind of gap between bodily experience, education, like life experience, and so on. And so Several biographical collections on the lives of female partisans and activists were published during the Socialist era, strongly emphasizing women's bravery, party loyalty, and sacrifice for the liberation of the country. But not much about ordinary women. It was more about this hagiographic publication on the leaders. And in turn, the scholarly works published after '89 generally dealt with women's experience from a gender perspective on the basis of the new feminist paradigm of women's history, and somehow they saw this experience of female leaders of the AFG as being co-opted by the communist framework, so they kind of neglected somehow the agency of these women. So the general interpretive framework of these works tend to emphasize Communist Party and state control over women's mobilization, documenting in particular anti-fascist women's gradual loss of autonomy during the consolidation of the socialist regime. And the dissolution of the AFG in '53 is generally read as the ultimate proof of such loss of autonomy by feminist scholars. But the AFG was never autonomous in the first place, which is something that we really have to remember. It was formed as a front organization. Even if it had some kind of autonomy across the various liberated regions, it was never, you cannot think of it as an autonomous institution from its very beginning. So this interpretation that women's interests are seen as inevitably opposed to state and party interests are the result of undermining the subjective break in traditional gender roles represented by women's participation to the partisan struggle and to the AFG. And it also tends to undermine women's agency, especially AFG leaders. And these are some of the quotes. For instance, Janka Webster, she writes in 1990 that, put a reference. For a while, women communists experienced the power and responsibility that derive from creating and turning the AFG into an effective service and procurement organization in the rear. When they were called to account and told to turn the organization into a communist-style mass organization, they did as they were told. The women who sacrificed their life to defeat the invaders and protect their homes were, in a very real sense, victims of the party that called them to its standards. And somehow she keeps reading in the rest of this passage women's lack of autonomy in the AFG as some kind of metaphor of women's powerlessness in socialist Yugoslavia, and up to the gender violence experienced by women during the Yugoslav wars. So she frames Yugoslav women's lives from '45 to the present in terms of constant victimization. And even the recent monograph by Jelena Baticic, which is extremely well researched and convincing, somehow does not challenge its interpretation of cooptation and reduction of autonomy. And as a result of such framework, AFG militants' biographies remain very much under-researched, especially when it comes to the leaders, but also the middle-ranking cadres of the organization. And this is something that Lydia Sklevitsky also somehow reinforced, even if she did this pioneering archival work of the organization, which was really like the founding one. And also for my dissertation, I rely a lot on her framework, also on this distinction between official and internal sources of the organization, because the official sources were very much this agitprop kind of literature that were supposed to present an image of the organization, but then there were a lot of internal discussion that showed that there were not everybody was agreeing on certain things, so there were a lot of like debates inside. But still, despite this pioneering work, Sklevitsky rejected, for instance, oral history interviews with partisans and former AFG members, which were at that time still alive, because she said most of the women participants, usually the ones who were the high-ranking members of the organization and still held considerable position of power afterwards, are eager to present their own experiences, visions, and memories as the only true version. And this was very much this conflict between the old left partisan generation and the feminist generation in the 70s and 80s. And while this interpretation have the merit of cautioning us against an excessively idealized image of the AFG experience, and they also point at dynamics of control and disciplining, they also ultimately undermine women's roles as organizational and political leaders and their different degrees of agency in promoting new gender imaginaries. They also conceal the new possibilities for political engagement, education, and labor that emerged after World War II allowed masses of women to undertake different choices and made possible an unprecedented generational break in women's self-determination as citizens and workers. Again, we have to read that break intersectionally, depending on which kind of resources women had available. And new political discourses and practices of women's activism in the Cold War era that also transnational character went beyond Cold War borders. So this was not just an experience of subjective break in Yugoslavia, but went beyond that through this organization affiliated to the WIDF. How am I doing with time?
7 minutes.
7 minutes, okay. All right. So I'm just gonna skip this part, but basically, again, there's been quite a lot of debate about the issue of how to assess women's agency in state socialist regimes and state socialist women's organization, and there's been a quite controversial article by the Net Funk on this women's organization, which gave rise to a number of responses on how to study these movements. And what I'm also arguing in my contribution to the discussion is for a more nuanced assessment of women's participation within the AFG. In the context of highly fragmented and decentralized state power, we cannot really talk of a homogeneous female subject. And just a few examples of these female activists' biographies, which happened at the crossroads of this contradiction between different conditions of political engagement and modern and so-called backward ways of living. So, for instance, one figure I mentioned in the article is Vahida Maglalic, the only Bosnian Muslim woman who was proclaimed national hero. She was the eldest of 10 siblings, born in Banja Luka in a respected Muslim family, whose father was the local Qadija, or Islamic judge. She was having a strong personality. She finished a girls-only vocational schools, and she dreamt of continuing her studies as a teacher, but she was not allowed. And then her brother, communist activist, started to bring her clandestine left-wing literature, and she would start reading that, and she also became an activist. Due to her free-spirit attitude, she quickly abandoned her full-face veil and even cut her hair short to the dismay of her parents, following the fashion of the time. She had a strong influence on other Muslim women and girls, whom she encouraged to pursue education and with whom she organized a number of excursions. Her father's house in Banja Luka became a site of anti-fascist activities under Ustaš occupation. Together with other notable partisans such as Dušan Kakovačević and Rada Vranješević, she often used the full veil as a source of hiding and to hold secret meetings with other clandestine fighters. Eventually, she was arrested and tortured and managed to escape, but she was again killed by German troops in 1943. Another interesting story that I quote in the book is the one of Didara or Ridaria Dukajini, a 17-year-old ethnic Albanian girl raised in a wealthy family in the town of Prizren, who was told by her father that she had to abandon the veil because he was one of these local notaries, so he had agreed with the Communist Party that she had to take off the veil, and she was really not happy with taking off the veil. She felt horrible and naked, and she cried. But after that, she was enrolled in a teacher training course, and 2 years later, she fell in love with a Serbian communist militant, so she escaped the family to avoid an arranged marriage with an Albanian man. And she later became a member of the AFG and some kind of living example of women's emancipation. So she was sent to the different villages to recruit other Albanian women. And after a short career as a teacher, she became a professional politician. And she became also the president of the local chapter of the Conference for the Social Activity of Women, which was this state socialist women's organization of the 60s. So these are just some of the case studies that I discussed in the chapter. Another one is Rajka Borojević, a partisan woman who took hiding in a village in Serbia during the war, and she felt indebted to the local population. And so she had been already part of the Central Committee of the AFG in the late 40s. So she led these cultural political courses for peasant women in Banja Luka, of which she's telling something here, how they would bring them to meet the shop workers, bring them to the cinema for the first time, try to show them how to manage the house. And what she did after was to create this weavers cooperative in this village of Donji Dubac, which employed 420 women in the early 60s. And she wrote a very nice diary about how to make this, how she created these classes for the village women in Donji Dubac, and she these classes included a theoretical part, so hygiene of the home, sexual education, first aid, childcare, alcoholism, food etiquette, and a practical part, cooking, serving, preparing preserves, soap, knitting, singing, handwork, and so on. And this Dragačevo cooperative became so important that in 1967 they had this best husband contest in the local village, during which women openly assessed the most respectable prospective mate. And there's a documentary you can see on Vimeo that her granddaughter, she's a curator in the Netherlands, and she restored this video and she made an exhibition on Rajka Borojević activism. So this activism somehow shows that a number of women who had come out of the partner experience embrace socialist values and strive to improve women's position, particularly from a social and economic perspective, in line with the idea that overall social progress had to be achieved also through the improvement of economic conditions and women's conditions. So it's, one thing to say, it's very important when studying this organization not to stop at 53 and to think that after 53 there is nothing, because as I show, for instance, Rajka Borojević, she was active in the late 50s. The FSJ was replaced by other organizations afterwards, and Sanda Perlenda in Croatia, she's working on these organizations from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, so it would be important to do more research on that part of the history because it's really not researched enough. And my last point is we should also be looking at social history in combination with political history, and especially at the experiences of working class women in the region, because somehow through the FSJ archives we get some of this peasant and working class experience, but that's always filtered through the eyes of this intermediate leader. So, so working class experiences are at the source of my book, which is on textile workers during socialism and in post-socialist times. And the image on the cover comes from this movie that I suggest you watch on YouTube as well, which is called From 3 to 10, or from 3 a.m. to 10 p.m., which is a movie about the life of a textile worker who works from 3 a.m. to 10 p.m. to combine productive and reproductive labor in the Pobjeda textile factory in Zagreb in the 60s. That's it. And so I believe that women's citizenship rights during the socialist era need to be read through an intersectional approach, which accounts for fundamental differences in terms of ethnicity, class, political background, and education, as well as different degrees on political and social agency. Women's individual life stories are another crucial themes that deserve to be explored further, so a combination of archive material, oral history, memoirs, and secondary literature can give us a sense of collective, but also of subjective transformations in the post-war and Cold War era. Sorry for taking some time. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Perfect in time. So I really thank Chiara Bonfiglioli for this rich and huge overview about the situation of the Anti-fascist Women's Front. And now I open the floor to the question, please. The first one, yes.
Thank you very much. That was really fascinating. I'm especially interested in the first part of your paper and about the IWDF. Thank you. I'm getting my WIDF. And I want to probe you a little bit further about how they define themselves around the issue of peace, peace and reconstruction, and how they situated their anti-fascism according to the Women's Peace campaign, the International Women's Peace campaigns, and how you would compare the reaction in the immediate post-First World War period and the way that women organized and mobilized for peace and the way they did so in the Second World War, after the Second World War.
Thank you.
Do you want to collect?
No, we can collect. And
okay. The second question.
Thank you very much. I was going to ask a question about the terror in Yugoslavia in the Tito period. After the Tito-Stalin split in 1948, I guess for at least 2, maybe 3, 4 years, there was a war atmosphere in Yugoslavia, a fear of Soviet invasion, that led to what we might, paradoxically, the terror was directed against so-called Stalinists, but it used Stalinist-style methods against so-called commonformists, those who allegedly supported the communist side. And when you showed that picture of the island, the peasant women who have been transformed onto the island, I'm reminded that I can't remember how you say it in
Goliotok, you mean?
The barren island, the prison island, where women as well as men were interned as supposed Stalinists or commonformists. So my question, you also showed the 1936 Stalin-era constitution, which is, of course, on paper, a very liberal constitution, but it came at the same time as the big terror in the Soviet Union, and at the same time as when abortion was made illegal again in the Soviet Union in 1936. So I suppose how do I form a question here? I mean, to what extent is the violence of the early Tito era, a gendered violence? To what extent, a bit like I was talking about yesterday, to what extent do some anti-fascist women then become victims of such terror? What about their rights as mothers and children when they're on barren island or in that kind of situation? And I suppose I can't help but, no offence to her personally, but Vida Tomšik, the anti-fascist leader between 48 and 50, I mean, how culpable was she for the terror system that was then in Tito's Yugoslavia at that time? Now, I appreciate that from the mid to late 50s there was a sort of de-Titoization, a kind of parallel to the Khrushchev era release of prisoners. But was there a rehabilitation program for anti-fascist women, partisans who had fought for Tito in the Second World War, then ended up being purged, and then were they a bit like in the GDR, were some let back into the party? Did they write their memoirs for the party in the same way and have to leave out their time as victims of communist terror, Titoist terror, in the period 48 to about 1952, at the same time as Vida Tomšik was the head of the Women's Anti-Fascist League?
Okay.
Do you want to answer? Yes, I think it's better. Because it's...
All right, so about the peace struggle, I mean, the WIDF was very much on this pro-Soviet side of peace, but they were doing a lot of initiatives that were also kind of more, going a step further. For instance, on the war in Korea, they had this report about the U.S. war crimes in Korea that made the United States authorities very, very angry because they were really sending people on the ground. And but I'm not an expert on the peace campaigns, and I'm really not an expert at all about the period after First World War, so I wouldn't go into a comparison there. What it happens is that after the expulsion of the Yugoslav women from the WIDF, the Yugoslav women decide to keep some kind of observer position when they're called to join the organization back again in 1956 after the reconciliation. And they somehow are quite wary of the Soviet propaganda, so they have some kind of critical position towards the Soviet direction of the WIDF as well. And that was not only them, so there was a lot of, the interesting thing about the WIDF is that there was a lot of internal discussions and internal debates, and it was not, even though it seems quite homogeneous on the documents published, but especially from the 50s, there were a lot of resistances internally also coming from women's organizations from former colonized countries that were, for instance, denounced that colonialism was never addressed enough, as in the case of Algeria or something. So the WFDF is really hard to pin down, and that's why most works are choosing one organization or two and comparing different case studies, because as a whole, it changed a lot throughout the periods, and yeah. Well, I think there were some communist women and anti-fascist women that were certainly in previous organization, and there were also some. No, it's not direct continuation. No. But some of them, for sure, and they were also, and not all of them that were communists, especially in this early years in this foundation of 45. Some of them came from this more liberal women's peace campaign. So that was quite different. Concerning the terror in Yugoslavia after the Tito Stalin split, so I wrote a chapter on this in my dissertation. But I'm also, again, not an expert on this Goli Otok, the barren island, and this other smaller island which was next to it, Sveti Gregor. The person who has been working very much on this is Renata Jambršić-Kirin at the Institute for Folklore and Ethnography in Zagreb, and she wrote a whole book about how Stalinist methods were used against Cominformists, or how they were called Inform Bureau supporters, and especially how these torture methods were also gendered. But the presence of women was quite limited, so they would say that through Sveti Gregor there were around 1,000 women going through. So in comparison to the male population of the Goli Otok island, which was, I think, I don't want to be wrong, but maybe 50,000. That was the 8,000 in total to Goli Otok. So yeah, so the women amount was. Yeah, for sure, and that's something that is still quite under research, and that all the memoirs started to come out at the end of the 80s, when there was this kind of more lax atmosphere in terms of dissident. So one memoir that's very interesting is the one by Eva Grlić. She was a partisan, and then she was sent there. And in terms of rehabilitation, look, and there's another movie actually, which is also quite interesting. It's called One Woman, One Century, done by Želimir Žilnik, this legendary Serbian filmmaker. And he interviewed also one of these women who was sent to Goli Otok and came back. And she was taking position for Stalin because she thought, we need to be allied of the Soviet Union. So there are a number of accounts that are coming out. A lot of these women had trouble to rehabilitate afterwards, especially in the early years, but then they were gradually somehow getting back into, but there was some certain stigma. A lot of people didn't say hello to them for a number of years, even when they came back. I mean, there was really this kind of silence surrounding it, so maybe people wouldn't talk about it. And but again, I cannot do an overall comparison on the topic, and on Vida Tomšić, how accomplished she was, I'm really not sure. The AFEŽ was publishing a number of documents. The AFEŽ was very much involved in this struggle against the Inform Bureau, because from the moment when they were expelled from the WIDF, they started to mail all the organizations involved in the WIDF saying, this is the wrong account you have, we are innocent, we are doing the right thing, we are the right socialists, and they started to really create these mass meetings against expulsion and stuff. But there were also some experience of micro-disciplining at the local level. For instance, if they would discover that one of the members is still suspiciously leaning towards Stalinism, there could be some like expulsion or at the local level. But again, that's something that I worked more in general terms, in terms of the position that was taken by AFEŽ members officially, and that's something, and this fight against, and the important thing to think is that this fight against the local dissident was not only local, but was transnational. So in Italy, the UDI was fighting the Titoists, okay? So they were taking position for Stalin. So, and in Trieste, there was a Stalin outpost of people fighting Titoism. So we have to think also in terms of this transnational discussion.
She only really believed in the rights of women who were not ethnic people, and if they were ethnic people at this time, if they were conformists, then they didn't have rights.
Yeah, to a certain extent, we could say that, yeah.
Yes, we have other question. I saw, yes, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chiara, for a very interesting presentation. I have just one question. I was quite provoked with the part on fighting the veil, because I was not aware of it from that time. So what is your interpretation? Is it kind of looking for a modern woman in comparison with those two pictures that you had women, peasant women, and then AFG women at the seaside coast? Is it the secularization, so fighting the religion, or is it early stage of the Islamophobia? So, what can be found in the fight against the veil?
There are other questions, because, if I may, just a moment, I want to jump in the question of the veil so we can link the two questions. How about propaganda and auto-representation in this question of the veil? Because I found really interesting, Chiara, when you show the papers, the paper, when the press, when you show the women laughing free from the veil, and then we read the testimony of the young girl that said, okay, but now I'm compelled by my father to put away the veil, and what happened to me now in this society, in the local society, where there are traditions, where there are rules, and so on. So I think there are various levels connected to the role of religion, of the community, of the consuetudini. Yes, what do you think about? So just to merge, and then we have other questions from the floor.
This is definitely very interesting, because I don't think it was only Islamophobia. I think it was really this kind of secularization and modernization project in a way. And it wasn't, and the headscarf as a headscarf was not in question. That could be worn, and it was kind of this peasant customary headscarf that could stay, but it was this full veil that, like some kind of burqa ban. We could compare it to the burqa ban. In terms of propaganda, there was definitely this propaganda and self-representation, as in many places, like in the Soviet Union, in Central Asia, like this idea, like we are the regime that's liberating women, and so on. What happened with this veil campaign was that there was a lot of fight on the ground, so a lot of religious authorities were telling, the local community, don't do this, the women are going to be sent to the prison or to the factory or whatever. So a lot of women were taking off the veil, maybe in these events for propaganda, but then they were putting it back. And there's an excellent archive material from Sarajevo, or one of these villages, that says there is this woman. She will be happy to take off the veil, but she has nothing else to wear. So can you please, help her to give her something else? So it was also this issue of poverty and a number of interrelated issues. And again, I wouldn't generalize, and I think that's why this digitalization of such archives are so important, because then we can have a more in-depth, localized view as well.
Please, other questions.
Most of the questions that have already been posted, but just to add actually to this debate about the Down with the Veil campaign, there is no question that it was anti-tradition. It was really geared against the Muslim population, obviously, because they were the only ones that had this. And it was really geared against any sort of tradition that had to be basically destroyed. And, this is why it also created such a, I think, it's important that you put up this recollection of this Albanian movement, because it did really create a lot of resentment on the part of the population, and many problems to the government at the time. My other question relates to what Matt was saying, and this is the issue of abortion. When it was banned and when it was reintroduced, and what did, if anything, Anti-Fascist Women's Front had to say about it. And as far as the Goliotto complex and the Grgur complex, one has to sort of keep in mind that there were women. I recall one particular case of Ženi Lebo, who was a journalist in Belgrade during the Second World War and immediately in the aftermath, and she ended up twice on Grgur. She was a Jewish woman on her way to Paris to become correspondent for Politica, the daily paper, and she was overheard saying a joke about Marshal Tito and ended up on Grgur. So eventually she emigrated to Israel after these 2 terms at Goli Otok. And I had a good fortune to talk to her in Israel. And one can sort of say that she was pretty reluctant, even in her, sort of late age, to discuss her experience of Goli Otok. So I wouldn't say that these people, or women at the Anti-Fascist Front were too sentimental when it came to basically the power game. Yesterday I mentioned Spacenia Tsana Babovic. She was a leader of the Anti-Fascist Women's Front in Serbia, and herself, an amazing woman and tremendously radical and committed. But when it came to 1971-72, Marshal Tito's fight against the liberals in Serbia, the liberal part of the Serbian Communist Party, she sided with him with no regard for Latinka Perovic, who was also a woman and also a representative of the party, albeit of the so-called liberal side of it. So one should always keep in mind, what I think Chiara mentioned and quite well in the beginning, that this was a hierarchical party which did not allow for any sort of leanings, especially at the time that we were discussing until the 53.
We have another question.
I'll just collect.
May we collect all?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your interesting talk. I have a very simple question. I would like to know what was the basis of recruitment of these activist women? So the factories, the parties, schools, university. So this.
In the FJ, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, so I'm just going to reply to the abortion. So the abortion was partially liberalized in the early 50s, so a bit earlier than in other places in the rest of the socialist bloc. But it was partially liberalized, so you still had to go through a committee that would give you a permission. So a number of women were reluctant to go through this committee, and they were having this backstreet abortion. And then in the early 60s, and now I can't recall exactly, but I believe it's the early 60s, there was a relaxation on this abortion for social reasons. So from then on, it became very much this basic method of contraception, because also contraception was also very limited, so it was used prominently by women throughout the socialist period. So I'd say, at the beginning there was maybe this more Stalinist interpretation of the feminine stuff, but they liberalized pretty quickly after the break, quicker than other places. And concerning the recruitment, it was different kind of. But it was kind of voluntary. I mean, in the sense, in some places there would be pressures done on women to join, but in a number of places it was also kind of accepted that women wouldn't engage in this. So it depends really if you look at the war period, where there was this whole chaos determined by the fighting and liberation areas, or the post-war period. I think in the post-war period there were a number of instances where women were just saying, I'm dealing with my family and not, probably until 53, until early 50s, there was quite a lot of ideological pressure, but then afterwards, to join this organization, if you would be engaged in the factory or if you would be engaged at the local level, you could be asked to join, but I wouldn't say there was enormous pressure, like everybody had to be in it.
Yes, we have another question. Then
Thank you very
I
much
think
for
it's the
your
last
wonderful
one.
presentation
Because
and for the very good discussions. I was wondering about how come that actually the reproduction was in a way put in the broader context of productive life. I have a couple of quotations here, and it really puzzled me. On the one hand, you have this definition of women's rights in political life, social life, and productive life. That was one of them. And then I think it was in the Constitution, you have very interesting categories put together: state, economy, and politically social, political life. And then I think it was in the Soviet Constitution or legislation, the interest of mother and child. How come that we have such, I would say, rather patriarchal wording, mother and child? And what was really, in a way, very interesting to put it in a very mild terms. The quotation you actually presented us, I think from Sklevitsky quoting Vida Tomšič, "We need to teach women to groom themselves well, to care for their households, and to do that quickly." That's another side of the coin, which perhaps you should stress it a little bit further. And what is most interesting for me is that actually all these new ideologies, for the better, for the worse, were supposed to be grounded in Marx, and there was no idea of, Engels's criticism, or at least idea that the productions are that a part of the production, the material production of things, as Engels puts it in his note already to the Communist Manifesto. There we have the production of people. Was there any kind of idea related to different, I would say, the very important difference between productive and reproductive work? Or was there just this idea that we should help women to be better productive workers and at the same time to better care for their household and do that quickly?
Yes, please, because this was the last one.
So as a last reply. This productive reproductive right is something. Productive realm is something I. Productive reproductive work is something I discuss a lot in my book, and because there was, I went a bit quickly on it, but this working mother-gender contract was supposed to help women to take part. But yeah, exactly. But this idea that men also could take up domestic work rarely came up. So there was the idea, okay, women's reproductive work is tying them to the house. We need to alleviate this through social welfare and by socializing a number of these tasks through, I don't know, canteens and like various social means, maternity leaves and so on. So they tried, but at the same time, as in this movie that I show you at the end, from 3 to 10 p.m., it was really hard for these women who came from the countryside to the city and then started to work in factories to manage this double burden. So the double burden is something that feminist scholars have been writing a lot about in relation to the socialist context, because it was really this strong experience of being overworked. Because these welfare services were not there. Many times the kindergartens were not there. Many times these women had to do the night shifts, and they came back at home and they still had to take care of the family. So it was really hard. But then with time, things got better. So there was less night shift, there were better services. But this was always very uneven throughout the federation. So certain places like Slovenia will be very advanced, for instance, in terms of social welfare and social networks, but other places, they were never reaching that kind of level. So that was also something that made this working mother-gender contract different according to where somebody would be located or what kind of resources one could avail of.
Yes, okay. We really thank you for this very interesting and stimulating talk.